What day was the first day back at school? Wednesday. So I happened to stop in this coffee shop because I saw it called Stories over there on like 180th. And I think every mom of every kid from the School of Elkhorn was in that place. And it was a party going on in there. They had some freedom and they were using it. So it was kind of fun to see that. Well, this morning we were picking up in Hebrews chapter 11, what we started last week, and that's hand-me-downs. And the idea comes from this idea of the definition of legacy, and the definition is this, that a legacy is something handed down from the past. Something that's passed down from ancestor, predecessor, from generation to generation. So we're talking about the idea of legacy is handed down to us from our predecessors. Specifically, lessons that we find in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. So last week, it was fun this morning because in your bulletins you see there that it's a word we don't use very often in a sentence, antiphonal. Now, I haven't used that word in a sentence, I don't know ever, except just now. So antiphonal is not one we use, so I'm going to throw out another word just since we're throwing out words we never use, and that's antediluvian. So. And what antediluvian means is pre-flood. So it was kind of a challenge to me last night because I was talking to my family about what I was preaching on, and I threw that out just for kicks. And they're like, what's that? Well, antediluvian means pre-flood. So last week we talked about Abel, and we talked about Enoch, and we talked about Noah, all these heroes of the faith that we know from before the flood. So now you have two words to add to your vocabulary, antiphonal and antediluvian. So do we need to go on? I mean, look what we did. So what we learned last week, we learned from Abel that the Christian life is about faith, not fluff. From Abel, we saw that it wasn't just about the stuff you put around and pretend like you got it together, but what really matters is your heart and that you've trusted in your heart. It's important to live things out, but ultimately, what you do comes from your heart and your decision to have faith. Enoch taught us that Christian life is about process, not position. That's not a place that you hold or a position in life, but rather it's process, the Christian life. And finally, from Noah, we learned that the Christian life is about anticipation, not acculturation. That is, that we anticipate the things of God, and we don't just acculturate, we don't just conform to the pattern of this world. So this morning we're going to pick up where we left off in Hebrews, and we're going to talk about the hand-me-downs from Abraham, Isaac, from Jacob, and from Joseph. And what I would call real life people living an adventure. And to be honest, I would like for us to begin to think of ourselves in the similar manner, that we're real life people living an adventure. And for these heroes of the faith, this is what it meant. They were real. And the Bible characters' lives that we look at, they're relevant lives. The truths that we see in their lives, the stories that we learn from them are relevant to our everyday life. And it's not some unattainable standard that they set before us that we can't aspire to. Instead, it's a real goal for real people in a real time that we can strive for. It's achievable. The second part is that it's live, real live people. These weren't some mythological creatures and beings out on some great adventure just that we read about in storybooks, but instead the Bible, and this is, I think, one of the strongest proofs of the reality of the Bible, the truth of the Bible, is when you look at the Bible, it doesn't sugarcoat its heroes. If you're reading a mythology, you don't see the blemishes of the heroes. But when you read the Bible, you see that these are live people with faults and shortcomings. And we see in those people, what we see is that God is at work. Not that these are some sort of heroic beings, some mythological creatures that we can't relate to, but that God is at work. So these are real, live, and what? People. And by people, the Bible shows us again and again the value of relationship. There's family lines. There's, as they say in high school and youth today are saying, there's squad goals, right? So as a squad goal, as a people group, we want to aspire to those things. So those relationships may be family, they may be group relationships, but ministry happens in the context of relationship. It happens where? With people. And finally, on an adventure. So real live people on an adventure. And I love this aspect of the Christian life because This is really what it's about. It's not that we just sit here and sit and soak, right? We open God's Word and we just let it soak in, and then we can talk about the number of angels that can dance upon the head of a pen. You know, that's not what the Christian life is about, some sort of intellectual exercise. Intellectual is important. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your what? Mind. Important, yes. But there is also an adventure to be lived out. God calls us to do things. Look what Noah, build an ark. Abel, offer up a sacrifice. Enoch, walk with God. So there's this walking and this moving and this going and this adventure. And I've heard it said, if you haven't failed, you haven't risked. And if you haven't risked, you haven't lived. And that's what the Christian life is about. It's a little bit about risk and adventure. And we have to take a chance sometime to live for God in a risky way and risk the possibility that we might fail. And I think God calls us as Christ followers to live this kind of life, the kind of life where the generations that follow us look to us and say, can you believe they did that? Can you believe that they started a church in the basement of a house? Can you believe that they built a house up on a hill or a church up on a hill? Can you believe that they sent people to Uganda? Can you believe this and that? God is doing a great adventure. Can you believe they turned to the person next to them in the workplace and said, let me tell you about Jesus? See, Christian living requires risk. And that's what we see here in Hebrews chapter 11, is real live people living in adventure. You know, we are called to live that adventure. As heroes of the faith listed for us here, they took risks. It's important to remember, too, that the context of this chapter is written to a people who were associated with those who were being persecuted. They were called to persevere in their faith. They were subjected to insults, persecutions, confiscation of property, and more. And so then we turn to Hebrews 11. It says, how do you face those kinds of challenges without turning your back on your Christian walk? This is how. Let me give you some examples. That's essentially what the author of Hebrews does. The point is that we don't throw away our confidence, but rather that we persevere. So we're called to turn toward things hoped for and things not seen. It shows that the adventure is worth the risk. Faith, we are told in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is lived out in the lives of these heroes of the faith listed for us. And the truth is that if we truly understand, if we have truly believed the gospel, it will change what we do and how we live. Martin Luther has said, we are saved by faith alone, but not a faith which is alone. In other words, we don't get to heaven by any other means but by grace alone. But if it stops there, your faith is not full. Your faith is not real, because our faith is accompanied by the things that we do. Again, Abel worshiped, Enoch walked, and Noah built. And today we turn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if we might receive the motherlode of spiritual blessings, we need to look at their examples and receive the hand-me-downs that they have to offer. So hand-me-down number 4. Oh, we need the bumper music. I didn't play the bumper music yet. Don't give me no hand-me-down shoes. Don't give me no hand-me-down love. I just like that song. It's fun. Hand-me-down number 4, certainty, not security. Certainty, not security. So if you have your bulletins and you'd like to take notes, there's a spot there you can write that down. Otherwise, make paper airplanes later. That'll be fine. Turn with me in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11 if you haven't done so already. In your Pew Bible, that's page 1192. So in Hebrews chapter 11 at verse 8 is where we will begin. It says this, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was what? Looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God. And jump down a few verses to verse 13, and we'll pick up there. It says this: all these people, that is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. We get kind of the context for this story in Genesis. Well, really, when you think of heroes of the faith, obviously Abraham is one of those who rises to the top. And there's a great context that we see in Genesis chapter 23, verse 4 about Abraham. And he's dwelling in the land of Canaan. And he spoke to the sons of Heth about purchasing a burial site in the land of Canaan for his wife Sarah, who had passed away. And in that verse he says this, I am a stranger and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial site that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Now here's some of the things that we learn from this simple little passage. And the first is this: in the land of Canaan. In Genesis 12, God had told Abraham, go to a land that I will show you. Now there was no, go to the land and I will make you prosperous. Go to the land, I'll give you great riches. Go to the land, it's just go to the land. There's no really subsequent promises in the original command of God to say, go. And what does Abraham do? Goes. At the initial request, God didn't give him a covenant promise that this land would be a land of inheritance. That doesn't come until a chapter or so later. In fact, it comes after Abraham and Lot have to choose lands, and at that point, he says, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. So long before the promises were told that he would have an inheritance in this land, Abraham went. He packed up his earthly belongings. He took every familiarity that he knew and he left it behind. In fact, his father continued to live in the land, his father Terah, and he lived there for another, I think 60 years was the time frame, but he left long before his father was gone, so he left everything that was familiar, he left all of his family, he left the land of Ur, he left his surroundings, he left his comfort, he left everything behind to pursue God. He was in now the land of Canaan. Second part that we learn from that verse is he claims for himself this title: I am a stranger and a sojourner. So another instructive piece that we see here is his identification as what his lot in life was. I am a stranger and sojourner. He was a foreigner living in a foreign land. Throughout Abraham's life, he would be known as a sojourner. He would be living out of tents. The only piece of property that Abraham ever owned in the land of Canaan was the burial site for his wife. God told Abraham, go to the land that I will show you. But in this passage, we see that he purchases a piece of land for his wife who has passed away, and that's all that he ever owned. And yet, he saw the promise. The third key element is the burial site. Now, many of you know that I've lived in Nebraska, grew up in Nebraska, that later moved to Iowa, then I moved to Illinois, then I moved to California, back to Nebraska, up to North Dakota, and back here again. I know, I feel sometimes a bit like a sojourner, foreigner in the land. And I would often ask my question, more specifically when I was in California, a little bit when I was in Illinois. And this isn't to be morbid or anything, but I would ask this question. It's like, if I were to die today, where would I be buried? I remember as a young child, my grandparents and my great-grandparents are buried in a cemetery in Blair. And I remember that as a child, we would go to the cemetery. My grandparents showed me the grave of my great-grandparents and said, this is the plot that we have purchased. So when we die, this is where we will be buried. And so with this idea of burial is this idea of connection. And you'll notice that Abraham didn't go back to the land of Ur and purchase promised land. Or didn't go back and purchase land in the land that was his family's land. He purchased it in the Canaan, in the land of promise. His connection was not to the things of the past, but the promises of God. That is where he found his connection. He would always live in tents. He would always be a wanderer and a sojourner. But he knew that this land is the land that God would give him, and the land that was the land of promise, and the land that would be for the people and the fulfillment of the promises of God. Now, Abraham told God to go to a land that I will show you. That's always a mystery to me. It's just, okay, God, where are we going? Because that's what we want, right? Okay, God, I need a play-by-play itinerary. I'm going to leave on this day. I need to arrive by this day. And when I get there, what am I going to do? Give me the step-by-step process. Once we have that laid out, if you would consult with me first, that would be great, because I have some really good ideas of how things should happen. And God just goes, no, just go. Go to the land I will show you. And I say, no, God. I need a little bit clearer of a picture than that. But God says, go. And Abraham went. You know, our culture is quick to define security based upon having a roof over our head. Perhaps it's about having a retirement portfolio, or maybe you live in a gated community. And those things for you define security. And security is a huge value in our culture, isn't it? But when we hold fast to security and having the plan figured out and trusting in those roofs and those gates and those portfolios, then we encounter problems. The lives of the patriarchs were lived in a matter of abandon. It's this burn the ships kind of attitude when they would come in across oceans and they would land and they would burn their ships because there's no turning back kind of picture. They pursued God regardless. But what was their motivation? And we see that in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 16. So if you're still there, look at verse 16. It says, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And it says, therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You see, God is preparing a city for us. We have not fully realized the promises of God, and those are still ahead. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not fully experience or did not fully realize the promises of God, but they knew that God's promises were trustworthy and true, that they could depend on them even though they could not see them. And the same has to be true for us in our Christian walks, is we do not always see the promises of God being lived out in our lives, but we have to hold fast to we know that that will happen. Contrary to what the world may tell us that this is foolishness or foolhardy for us to believe these things, we persevere and we trust and we lean forward into those promises. And God is not ashamed to be called their God. Time and again in the Bible it says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And how did they get the privilege that God identified himself as their Father, as their God, was because of their obedience. You know, it was like a bragging rights. At Abraham, I'm his God. Look what Isaac did. I'm his God. Look what Jacob did. I'm his God. And what about you? Does he say the same things about you? Look, I'm his God. Look, I'm her God. Would you look at what they did today? That was so awesome that they were willing to go and pursue and follow me. And so I am going to brag on them. It was God's bragging rights for his people. He would brag on his children by associating his name with them because they were willing to go and trust the promises even when they couldn't see them. This hand-me-down teaches us that we are called to live in certainty of God's promises, not in the security of earthly things. Our security is not found in the things of this earth, but in the heavenly country which is ahead. Erwin McManus once said that we are called to live dangerously, but never in danger. What he meant is that we may not be in a land with secure walls or secure surroundings or a secure roof. We may not be in a gated community or surrounded by impenetrable forces. We are called to risk it for God. We are called to live dangerously. But then he goes on, you're called to live dangerously but never in danger. The safest place to be is in God's will. This is true. But being in God's will doesn't mean playing it safe. You see the difference? We are called to live with certainty, not security. We turn now to the fifth hand-me-down. And that fifth hand-me-down is this: trust, not turmoil. In Hebrews chapter 11, again at verses 11 and 12, it says, by faith Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he is good as dead, how would you like that as kind of, it's a real kind of insult, isn't it? I mean, this guy was old, he was practically dead, and still, and this is what's written again, showing the blemishes of the heroes of the faith in the Bible for us to see. This one man who was as good as dead, from him came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. A few verses down, verse 17 through 19, it says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Now, for those of you who've been around Christianity for any amount of time, I know that you've heard this story, and I know that even here on Sunday mornings in Sunday school, you've been studying this story. So I know this story is familiar to many. That God made the promise to Abraham and Sarah that from them would come a great people, a great nation. God provided this child of promise, even in their old age, so that his name is called Laughter, because they thought it was so ridiculous that they could be having a child at this age that Sarah laughed, and so his name was called Laughter, Isaac. But God did the unthinkable. Not just giving birth, but then asking for this. I want you to sacrifice this child. Unthinkable, right? How could God take this one person of promise, this one thing? God, you said that through Isaac we would be blessed and that we would build a great nation. And then God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. Unthinkable. But you know what we never see from Abraham is this idea of unthinkable. There is no indication for us anywhere in the text that Abraham says, God, no way. When we fail to trust God's promises, our lives are marked by turmoil, aren't they? But there's no indication of inner turmoil here for Abraham. There's no indication that he wrestled with God. Instead, he takes Isaac and walks with him up the mountain. And what we see here is the question that is never raised in the text is this, is how could God ask such a thing? That is not the dilemma that happens here. There is no ethical dilemma. There is no moral dilemma that is presented for us in the text. Instead, the question that is raised by Abraham and the rest is this. How is God going to take his promises and his command and balance them? Because God promised that through Isaac we would be a great nation. But God commanded me to sacrifice my son. But at no point do we see any indication that there's an internal turmoil going on that Abraham says, it's impossible. Instead, he says, I will trust you. We are called to trust God's promises and obey God's commands. And then we trust God to work it out in such a way that those two things will align, that both will be satisfied. So we often have turmoil, don't we? Because we're saying, God, you promised. God, I don't know how what I'm expecting you to do for me is going to work out in this way because this doesn't line up. And again, we try to scheme, don't we? We try to create plans for God, and he says, trust me. God calls us not to turmoil, but to trust. The sixth hand-me-down is surrender, not scheming. In Hebrews 11, verses 20 through 21, it says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. And this passage tells us about the blessings of Jacob and Esau, the blessings by Isaac, and the blessing of Joseph by Jacob's son. And it's an interesting thing. Again, kind of the real live people on adventure. These people are real and they're live, and it's messy because there was a whole lot of scheming going on, if you remember, right? If you recall that when it was time for Isaac to bless Jacob, that Isaac said, I'm hungry, go get me something to eat. When you come back from hunting, I will bless that. That's what he said to Esau. That's not what he said to Jacob. And so Esau goes out to hunt, and Jacob Well, mom overhears, and mom says, I got a plan. I'm going to make his favorite stew, going to put that on the stove, and I know you don't smell it like your brother because you tend to work in the kitchen and in the fields, and he's out there in the countryside, smelly and hairy, so we're going to cover you with some garments. We're going to put your brother's clothes on. We're going to cover your hands with goat skin. So they do all this, and they scheme, and they scheme, and they scheme. And when they come in, Isaac then gets the blessing that was intended for the firstborn. And there's a whole lot of scheming going on. And then we go and we turn to the life of Joseph. And Joseph, it's time that they're in Egypt, and he has risen to this place of prominence. And at this point, they have revealed himself to his father Israel now at this point, Jacob. They've revealed himself to them. And so now it's time for him to bless his oldest, or his boys. And so he puts boys in front of him, Joseph, and he arranges them in such a way so the oldest is at Jacob's right hand and the younger one at his left hand. And then Jacob does this: I'm going to bless you. Literally, that's what he does. He crosses his arms so that the blessing that should belong to the oldest is now given to the younger. And so there's all this kind of scheming that goes on, but the Bible does not raise that issue when it talks about faith. Instead it says that the promises were about the future. And we see some of the scheming and some of the things that in our hearts, in our minds we cry foul, right? That's just not right. That's just not fair, because we have this overdeveloped sense of justice. And so we're calling foul on this, and yet there's no indication that in the scripture that is a problem. Instead it says, don't worry about this. I've got it under control. You worry too much. See, Jacob's life, we kind of get this picture a little bit later in the life of Jacob, that things are a little bit different. And it comes later where they, after he's done the scheming, after he's received the promises, where he comes out and he says this. He says that, I will bless you and you will inherit the land that was given to who? Abraham, your father, and to Isaac, to me, Jacob. And he passes that blessing on. Because there was a promise. Again, what is the promise? It is for the promised land, but it's not just the place. It's the future city, the future country, the future heavenly country, right, that is ahead. And so there was this transition where he went from this schemer to this place of surrender. And he surrendered his life to God. And he says, it's no more scheming. It's trusting God and surrendering to his plan. And we want to scheme, and we want to control, and we want to tell God how things should be. And God just says, relax, surrender, and trust. So 3 hand-me-downs we've seen so far is the Christian walk is about certainty, not security. It's about trust, not turmoil. And it's about surrender, not scheming. Which brings us to the 7th hand-me-down, and that is providence, not prestige. Providence, not prestige. And here's what I mean. Providence is the belief that God is continually involved in our lives with creating things, preserving things, directing things, governing things. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, we read, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. Now, as you look back on the life of Joseph, you know that there was a great deal of providence. And it was very much unseen, I think, to Joseph, because Joseph had these dreams that one day his family would come and bow down before him. But then there was this in-between time where his brothers take him and throw him in a pit. And then he's sold to traders. And then he goes to Egypt, and there he is, he's given a place of prominence, but then he's thrown into jail. And then he's forgotten in jail for a number of years. But then eventually God raises him to the position when he interprets the dream for Pharaoh that puts him in a position to be the second in charge of everything, all of the property, all the stuff that's in Egypt, and puts him in a very important position of prominence. But in that in-between time of sitting in a jail cell, sitting in a pit, I can just imagine he's going, God, I thought you were in control. I thought you had things under control. But after all of that, I think he must have looked back and said, it happened. It really happened, just like God said. It happened because his brothers come and they bow down before him so that they can get some of the food that Egypt had stockpiled. You know, at the end of Joseph's life, he was in a very important position. He could have, when he died, had a pyramid built for him. And it would have been loaded with all the gold. You remember back in the day when King Tut, all that treasure was found, and we saw the great gold and all those things. That was the type of position that Joseph held. And he would have been entitled to the same sort of honors as King Tut. But what does he say? Take my bones when you leave Egypt and make sure they get to the promised land. Now, this was before they even knew that the Egyptians were going to enslave the Israelites. That comes later. But he, in his mind, knew what God had for the Israelites, a land of promise. And he knew that Egypt, in all of its prominence and prestige, was not the place for him. He knew that the place that he belonged was a city that had no foundations, the heavenly city, the promised land of God. And all of these men, despite their circumstances, looked forward to a place that was ahead. The hand-me-down we receive from Joseph reminds us that the Christian life isn't about prestige. It's not about working to a position where you are entitled to great things. There was never an entitlement mindset in Joseph's head. His mindset was, I will pursue God and his promises. The Christian life isn't about prestige. It's about God's providence, about God's control, about God's work in your lives, and your trust in him to pursue those things. The truth is that we are all aliens and strangers in this land. People who say such things, it tells us in Hebrews 11, show that they are looking for a country of their own. Where is your gaze? Where is your focus? Where are your goals? Are they set on the earthly things? Or are you longing for a better country, a heavenly one? What is it you're longing for? Maybe you are longing instead for security. Maybe if I had a little bit more money. Maybe if I had a little bit more of my retirement portfolio. Maybe if I had a nicer house. Or maybe if I moved away from this troubled area and into a little bit further out into the suburbs, into a better neighborhood. Maybe then I'll have the security and then I can be at ease. Our security is not in the things of this world, but in the certainty that God is with us wherever we go. Maybe you're longing for control. Your life is in turmoil because you demand to have things your way. You demand to have things just so. And God says, calm down, I got this. God calls us to trust, and God calls us to surrender. And he calls us to trust his plan that he has for us. And maybe what you're really longing for is prestige, to be known, to be recognized, to be identified when you walk into the marketplace or wherever it might be. You want to be remembered. You want to be admired. God can use people in high positions, absolutely. But high positions is not what God says is the end goal. Providence recognizes that God is in control and calls us once again to surrender. We are called to a better country, a heavenly one. We are called not to pursue our own agendas, but God's. In the end, the only thing that will help us face trials when they come our way is that we trust God and not our own scheming. Could you imagine how it might just change the world if we began to live not for our selfish purposes, but instead surrendered to God? Instead of being consumed by the things of this earth, if we are consumed by the things of God. What it says is that faith is the assurance of things hoped for. What are the things that you truly hope for? Really, those things are the things that God hopes for you. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We hope for a better country. We hope for a place where there is no longer sickness or death or dying. We hope for a place where there is no sorrow. We hope for a place that even in the midst of these trials, there's a place beyond. And we hope for a world that doesn't fall apart. Where is your hope? It's not in the government or circumstances. It is not in the things around us. Our hope is for a better country, an eternal country, a new heaven and a new earth where Christ is seated. That is our hope. And because we have hope in that and trust in the promise, we know that this world in which we live, we do not need to be conformed to it, but we can live for the promises of God. That is our hope. Will you pray with me? Lord, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And we've put our hope in so many things besides the things of God. We've put our trust in things outside from you. We trust our own abilities. We trust our own wisdom. We trust our own insight and circumstances instead of trusting you. And for that, Lord, we ask your forgiveness. Lord, may we find our hope in you, and may we turn to you and the eternal city, the eternal country that is ahead, and place our hope in the promises of God and your providence instead of the things of this earth. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.